Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson, Chapter 10, People of European Descent. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the discourse about white people or Caucasian people. We'll be using those interchangeably because, again, some people prefer white, some people prefer Caucasian. It's no means of offense to anyone when I'm lecturing this way. All right, seen as middle class, qualified, oblivious about whiteness, unsure allies in ending racism, smart, capable, successful, beneficiaries of God's grace, hardworking, normal Americans, necessary, in charge, and powerful. Okay, so when people think of white people, that's what they're saying is like people just assume these things. The US Census says that white refers to a person having origins in any of the original people of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. It includes people who are indicated their races as white or reported entries such as Irish, German, Italian, Lebanese, Arab, Moroccan, or Caucasian. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the immigration. So 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, modern humans were in Africa. But they found a skull fragment found in Israel, which may be around 60 to 70,000 years old. And that's what this picture is of. So they're saying that although it's human, it's a little bit different, right? So basically what they're saying is humans and Neanderthals lived together and interbred, which basically means, okay, so this is kind of like a science thing right here. There are different types of people, quote unquote, and some were called humans and some were called Neanderthals, and there might have been a mix because they bred together and they were able to have children and stuff like that. So this is how there's a huge lineage differences between all the different types of people back in prehistory. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about more modern America. Okay, 1607, Jamestown, Virginia, first permanent English settlement. There were 104 English colonialists. 31 survived the first winter. The next 15 years, about 10,000 more people arrived, and about 2,000 actually survived living in America. In 1614, New York, the Dutch came over, and in 1620, the Mayflower Pilgrims arrived. 1650s, the French settled in Newfoundland, Canada. American colonies. So these are the 13 original colonies in America. They were Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia. But Americans were not the only colonizers of America. We also have people from the Netherlands, also known as the Dutch, the Russians, the Spanish, and the French. And this is why you'll see areas where people speak Dutch or Russian or Spanish or French or even German as well in different parts of the country. Part of that is because of the old history of the colonizers. In 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. In 1781, we had the Revolutionary War, which is basically Americans' conflict with British taxes and unequal rights. And they won against the British because the French helped the colonists. In 1850s, Irish and German immigrants, more than half of the population left for the Americas. The definition, okay, so here's the two different ones, right? There's the immigrants with an E. Immigrants, let's use that as the audio so you can tell, is the act of leaving one's resident country with the intent to settle elsewhere. Okay, so eg is kind of like the word exit. Okay, immigrants is the movement of persons into one country from another. So the actual action of it is that. So you emigrate from one country to immigrate to another. Okay, you're actually going from one place to the other, which is immigration, but leaving the country is called emigrating or emigrating. They sound very similar. All right, in 1820 to 1870, 7.5 billion immigrants, 1/3 were Irish and 1/3 were German. They built canals and they constructed railroads. So here's some pictures of people who are of Irish and German descent. Ireland, depending on potatoes for survival, but there were 3 continuous years of crop failure. It's also known as the potato famine. So there are some photos of a healthy potato and a diseased potato right there for you. 750 people starved to death because of this potato famine. In America, they moved to the Northeast and lived very tough lives. Greedy landlords, poverty, crowding conditions of living, and also disease. Okay, so this is an interesting and kind of controversial area. The Irish were known as the Negroes turned inside out, which sounds awful, right? But this is part of history. African slaves were also known as smoked Irish, and the abbreviation of NINA stands for No Irish Need Apply. So there were a lot of people who did not like the Irish in America, so they went through an area as well. But slavery is still probably considered the most heinous thing to have been done to a group of people. Okay, so but the Irish are not treated the same way slaves were. That's a different thing, so we should not compare the two, although they were called Negroes turned inside out. But the Irish tried to lose their Irish identity and abuse African slaves. So because they are very Caucasian or very white looking, right, eventually they started to de-identify with that, just identify as white and stuff like that, and then try to be like other white people or the what is quote unquote the best type of white people, and they also owned slaves as well. German immigrants had money and moved to the Midwest for farmland and work. New York City is also another area that was very popular. Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. So if you go to those places, you'll see a lot of German stuff, like cultural stuff. Language, people still speaking it, and stuff like that. There's also religious fights between the Protestants, Catholics, and Roman Catholics. There is a group called the Nativists who emerged. They're anti-Catholics known as the Know-Nothings. And what they did was they wanted longer time before immigrants could become citizens and could vote. Basically, they don't like foreigners, right? Prevent foreign-born people from holding public office. And in 1844, Depression quieted down the political unrest. So because of Depression, then they were less powerful, right? But before that, nativists or the know-nothings really didn't like foreigners. They just liked their white people, their own people, and that is it. In 1861, we had the Civil War. Confederate slave states, with their leader, President Jefferson Davis. So we're talking about this, the Confederate states were Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Okay, so those were the states that are part of the Confederate slave states. In 1865, the Confederacy was defeated, and we talked about, remember, in the African American chapter about Abraham Lincoln. So the Confederacy was defeated in 1865, and slaves were freed, although they weren't really freed, right? It took a little bit longer when we talked about Juneteenth. Now let's talk about the geography and the demographics. 2010 census says that there were 308.7 million people who identify as white or Caucasian, 223.6 million identified as just white, 72%, and 7.5 million identified as white and other. So we're talking about being biracial. Majority of growth for white people are white with another ethnicity. So that's a growing population. German and Irish represent the two largest white ethnicities. Decreases in language use, so people who are Italian, Polish, Yiddish, German, and Greek started to use less of their own language and started to speak English. White alone populations, the South had 68 million, the Midwest is about 52 million, the Northeast is 38 million, and the West is 38 million. The highest population of mixed white people are in the West. When it comes to social, psychological, and physical health issues, the oldest median age is about 42.3. The median income is 54,620. White women have had the highest benefits when compared to minorities. The feminist movement, the suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote, not the right to suffer, which I sometimes hear my students tell me what suffrage is. It's actually the right to vote. Okay. And of course, affirmative action. So white women were able to benefit from all of these things before people of color were. Now let's talk about white racial identity development. White people are shaped by the construct of race in their own and other people's lives and are affected by both skin color privilege and the adverse consequences of racism. So this is the talking about the fact that because white people are considered the ideal, how are they seen when they are working with people of color, right? How is their relationship between people of color and people who are white? This is the kind of complex but really interesting conversation. There's a need to develop a positive racial identity that does not emanate from oppression and domination. So we're talking about, can white people exist in a happy sense without acknowledging or having to acknowledge the fact that there was racism and oppression in society, right? It's an interesting question, right? And we should be able to talk about this. And obviously, we're not going to always agree or agree on the same things. So here are some areas of difficulty when it comes to this. It is possible for white people to live in the U.S. society without having to acknowledge or give much consideration to the meaning of being white. And denial about one's own race impedes self-awareness, a crucial factor in racial identity development. So what that is saying is, can you be white without comparing yourself to people of color, to know that you are better than, right? Or assume that better than, or the differences, right? And that's kind of complex. I wish we had this conversation in class. It's a little bit more difficult to kind of explain to you guys, but I'm hoping that you guys are starting to get what I'm talking about, right? And again, we are not putting down anyone who is white at all. This is a conversation about how people see ourselves, or how do we define ourselves by defining other people. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about white identity or Caucasian identity, let's actually talk about models that were developed to kind of help us understand how or see where people are when it comes to this. It's called white racial identity and white racial consciousness. So white racial consciousness is the ways that white people think about people who are not white, the racial outgroups. Identify commonly held constellations of attitudes are achieved and unachieved. So there's two different groups that they're going to define. Unachieved means not yet committed to, okay? So they're still dependent and their attitudes are determined by a significant other. So maybe family is how they are taught how to see themselves and how to see other people. Dissonant or uncertainty about attitudes, and then avoidant, which is attitudes that ignore and or minimize racial issues. So people who don't think that race is such a big deal, okay? But there are people who have achieved this consciousness, which are people who are conflictive, which describes fairness, but where rugged individuals is strong. So what that means is they understand that there's something different between the races and them as a white person, and they feel conflicted about it, right? Because they're their own person, they're thinking, they're not relying on other people to tell them how to think. There's also diminutive, which basically means, or dominative, I'm sorry, which describes ethnocentric or pro-white attitudes. So they're going to understand how there are people who favor, or most people, let's say, society favors people who are white. And then there's integrative, which reflects positive and pragmatic attitudes. And then reactive, which are groups which are strong pro-groups of color attitudes. So those are people who include people and acknowledge the fact that there's a difference. We're going to actually explain more of this as we go along. It's actually even more complex when I was learning about this to explain from this perspective than it is from a person of a color perspective. It's really interesting. I wish we were in class to be able to talk about this. Do you find all of this really interesting? I think it is, right? So one more way of you to understand this is to look at this Prezi that I hyperlinked of Helm's white racial identity. She's the one who basically explains all of this, which has 6 statuses. Instead of 6 phases, they use statuses instead. And if you do have a disability or a screen reader that you need, if you scroll down past the Prezi, you'll see the transcript, which is labeled as reader view. and that will allow you to see what the Prezi is all about. All right, so now let's actually look at all of those statuses that we just talked about. The first one is called contact. Idealistic about Black people, coming from trepidation or naive curiosity. So you actually don't really know anything about it. So you're like, oh yeah, being Black is whatever, it's great, blah, 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 right? But not really understanding what it means to be a Black person. Benefits from institutional and cultural racism without the conscious awareness of doing so, which basically means that because you're white and you don't even realize that there are people who are oppressed or discriminated against, you're like, oh, life is great, right? Information processing, obliviousness, which basically means that you're just not aware of what's going on. Satisfied with the status quo, does not know much about the role of racism, and have positive self-esteem. You do love yourself. You're like, there's nothing wrong with the world. And when interacting with Black people, may have some anxiety. Okay, so that's the first status. The second status is disintegration. So it's continued interaction with Black people moves them to disintegration. White people realize that people are treated differently as a function of race. Information processing is suppression and ambivalence. Ambivalence is like, I don't know what's going on. Truly confused about with anxiety, provoking racial moral dilemmas. You start to feel nervous, like, wait a minute, there is a difference between the two. What is going on? And feel like they have to choose between own group loyalty and humane behavior. So should I stay with my crew of white people or my white population? Or should I choose the other one where we have to talk about racism and discrimination? The next status is called reintegration. White people realize that within the dominant culture, the covert and overt belief of white superiority and Black inferiority exists. So when you are in this status, you do realize the fact that white people have a better life than people who are Black. Okay? Desire to be accepted by the white group is strong. Important to acknowledge that racial identity is also there, and see minorities are morally, socially, intellectually inferior. Okay? So we still see that, we don't know what to do. Because honest dialogue about race between racially different people does not often take place, people tend to stay in the status. So because people don't talk about racism or whatever, or the people around you, because they don't understand it or they don't want to understand it, then you kind of maybe stay stuck there. Okay? The information processing during this status is selective perceptions and negative outgroup distortion. Whites are idealized, others are not. Okay, so that's interesting. And then we go into the next status, which is pseudo-independence. First stage of redefining a positive white identity. The intellectualization, which is white people acknowledge responsibility for white racism. White norms continue to be used to interpret cultural or racial differences, and the information processing during this time period is reshaping reality, commitment to reach out and assist other racial groups. So now you're going, you know what? I understand what's going on. I can't help it that I'm white, right? That's not the blaming part, but I can make a difference in society, okay? And then there's an immersion status, which is replacement of old myths and stereotypes with accurate information. So you don't just live in this world where world is happy and problem free, but to realize that actually reality is that there is discrimination and oppression. A period of unlearning. So you're unlearning the things that you were told when you were in just, let's say, a white group. Participate heavily in white consciousness groups to abandon a racist identity, and to focus on change of white people. So you're going to try and help other people who are white who might be in those other statuses so they're aware of what the real world is really like. And the information processing is hypervigilance and reshaping. Hypervigilance is basically being really aware and wanting to make change and helping and stuff like that. And of course, reshaping, which is basically, again, just changing how society is. And the last status is called autonomy, which is an ongoing process, right? Because we're forever students, we're forever learning. Primary goal is internalizing and experiencing new ways of being racial that were learned from previous stages. So now as a white person, you're starting to understand how society is, right? And to be able to accept certain things and learn different things and experience those things. Race, your own or others, is not a threat. So you don't see black people as scary or threatening or anything like that, or other people of color as well. Information processing is it's flexibility and complexity, which basically means that all the stuff that we're talking about when it comes to race is really complex. It's really layered, right? And to acknowledge that and accept the fact that there's a lot of questions and understanding between everyone. Okay, and then defining the self and relinquish the privileges of racism. So to be able to basically be an ally in a way where you're saying, I'm going to speak up when I see racism or oppression, and I am going to discuss that and openly talk about that, and maybe even influence and teach my fellow white people to understand what it is if they don't acknowledge or understand it. And you kind of see that a lot right now, right? In 2020 with Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, as people wanting to be allies. But not to be just performative. Performative basically means you're showing like, oh yeah, I'm not racist. I'm going to Instagram a picture of a black person, right? And that's not really doing anything. Have you actually done anything to really help society be a better place? And that's what it means to, let's say, go into this status identity consciousness that we've been talking about in the last couple of slides, and not just be performative. All right, now let's talk about implications for mental health professionals. Colorblindness, basically denial, distortion, and or minimalization of race and racism is not good, right? So we need to acknowledge that. One way to define racial inequalities in the US is by saying that you're colorblind. But I will tell you this, previous generations were told if you were not racist, you didn't really see color, okay? And I know that you millennials and you Gen Zers are like, that's awful because you're basically ignoring the rich culture of diversity. And that's very true. But to get to where you guys are, there were other levels of non-racism that we were taught to believe in. And one of them, and I'll be honest, when I was younger, when I was a kid and stuff like that, we normally, if we were not racist or non-prejudiced, we would say, oh yeah, humans are humans and that's it, right? But that's because that's one of the first steps when it comes to acknowledging the fact that, we're trying to not be racist or prejudiced. And this is how we thought was the best way to do it. And now, as we get older, we realize from you millennials and Gen Zers is that actually each ethnicity is really rich with information and we should appreciate those things. So if you do hear an older person talk about how they don't see race, I'm going to ask you to not like yell at them or scold them or anything like that, but to have a conversation with them and ask them and learn more about how they came to define themselves that way. Okay, because I see a lot of times Gen Z and millennials having a really difficult time communicating with boomers or Generation X or even older than that. And I really want you guys to have a really good conversation, not a one where you guys are fighting and yelling at each other, because older generations might not understand the new generation and their perceptions on racism, right? And most of the people that you'll see are not racist, but they don't have the vocabulary that you have to communicate in a way. So to have this conversation in a way that lets them understand and learn is really good. Okay, race should not and does not matter appears admirable and seems to embrace multiculturalism. However, ignoring race distorts the reality of racism and upholds the status quo. Okay, again, older generations were taught in a different way to see racism or race. So I hope you guys as millennials and Gen Zers are able to have that conversation with the older generation and not make it scary or upsetting or annoying or anything like that, but actually growing. Okay, lower levels of white fear of people of color have more interracial friendships. How mixed race may want to identify with white people, and how interracial relationships sees the white identity are areas that you want to also explore as well. So when we talk about allyship, like I said before, what white people can do about white privilege, right? So one is accept the discomfort of contending with racism. So as a white person, right, to be able to be uncomfortable and be okay with being uncomfortable, okay? That's okay. Being uncomfortable is totally fine. but we just don't like it sometimes. But we should be aware that we can become uncomfortable and it'll still be fine. Two, look at your perpetuation and acceptance of white privilege. So now, as a white person, let's say, do you see how you allow racism to happen in your environment? Okay. Three, when you see a white privilege in action, say something, right? Four, do not get stuck in guilt. We don't want white people to feel guilty, okay? We want white people to acknowledge what's going on and be aware of what's going on, because that's really how people get together and be able to make change. And five, take responsibility for your privilege and be a strong ally. So what are you doing? Are you just being performative, like we talked about before, or are you really honestly doing things that are going to help society as well, right? So that's happening more and more now with millennials and Gen Zs. Like I said before, I'm so proud of you guys. Um, but also, you know, be patient with the older generations that might not have the same vocabulary and understanding of race that you do.